Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Made by McGill Alumni Webcast, Defining Freedom in the Time of COVID. My name is Derek Kassoff, Managing Director of Communications at McGill's Office of University Advancement, and it's Wednesday, February 9th, 2022. And if my math is right, this makes it the first Made by McGill Alumni Webcast of McGill's third century. As governments go to great lengths to protect their populations from the coronavirus and develop strategies to encourage the unvaccinated to get immunized, some are questioning whether certain public health measures might be redefining what freedom looks like in a democratic society, while giving unprecedented social and legal weight to our right to good health. Under what conditions and to what extent can governments place limits on the rights, the choices, and the freedoms of their citizens? Can they forbid citizens from attending religious services or welcoming guests into their private homes? And do demonstrations, such as the recent Freedom Convoy to Ottawa, represent the views of a vocal minority? Or are they a sign that the population has grown frustrated with governments dictating when they can travel, where they can shop, and who they can socialize with? Joining me today to discuss these thorny questions and more are two of McGill's leading experts working at the intersection of public health policy and civil liberties. Let me introduce them. First, we have Professor Pearl Eliadis, who's an associate professor professional at the McGill School of Public Policy and a lecturer in civil liberties at McGill's Faculty of Law. She's an award-winning lawyer, educator, and author, and in her private law practice has successfully led complex global human rights and governance projects, including a mission to Sri Lanka to assess civil and political rights in that country as the close of a civil war marked the end of a 25-year state of emergency. Welcome, Professor Eliadis.
Thank you.
And we have with us Professor Nicholas B. King, who is an associate professor at McGill's Biomedical Ethics Unit, as well as an associate member of the Department of Epidemiology and the McGill School of Public Policy. Professor King's primary research areas are public health policy, ethics, and epistemology, and he's particularly interested in how scientific evidence is shaped by human interests and hidden value judgments, which in turn shape individual decisions, collective behaviors, and public policies. And if ever we have seen these phenomena play out so sharply, it's been during these 2 years of the pandemic. So we have lots to talk about. And welcome, Professor King.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So we have lots to talk about over the next hour. And hopefully our two expert panelists can shine a bit of light on some of the more provocative and divisive aspects of this ongoing pandemic. But before we jump into today's conversation, a reminder that if you're watching live and you have questions for our panelists, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca, and we'll do our best to address them to our guests. So before we jump into some of the questions I referenced in my introduction, I think it might be helpful to understand a bit more about each of your areas of research and expertise. Professor King, maybe I'll start with you. What sorts of practical issues does a professor of biomedical ethics focus on? And with what framework have you and others in your field viewed the policy decisions being made during this pandemic?
Well, thanks, Derek. People often look to ethicists to tell them the right way and the wrong way to do things. I teach courses, and at the end of the course, my students generally say, well, Professor King, what's the right way to do things? And there are some cases in public health policy and policy more general where the right way to do things is pretty clear cut. But I'd say more often, and especially in the area of public health, they just aren't. Public health decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty, often extreme uncertainty about what the consequences of different policy decisions are going to be. And they involve trade-offs, including balancing individual freedoms and collective responsibilities, which is the subject of today's discussion. So the way I think many of my colleagues in ethics view policy decisions during the pandemic is to first acknowledge the trade-offs. I don't think it does anyone justice or any good to pretend that there aren't really important trade-offs there. But then we have to try to figure out how to assess them. We have to determine whether they're justified and whether they're proportional. So with respect to the subject of this panel, I think there are several key questions. First, are freedoms or rights actually being restricted? Second, if so, are the restrictions justified by the potential harms to public health? And finally, are there any particular groups who are being disproportionately harmed by either the restrictions or lack of restrictions? And these seldom have easy answers.
Wow, you've already given me a lot of great ideas for questions I can come back to you with. So thanks for that great introduction. Professor Eliadis, you come to this discussion with a broad background in human rights issues at the global level. So I'm wondering, how have you applied that lens to the way in which our local and national governments have implemented public health policies in the efforts to contain this pandemic?
So I'd like to pick up a little bit, Derek, and thanks for that question on what Nick was just saying. So one of the overriding rules, if you will, from a human rights perspective is that human rights are considered to be interdependent. That there isn't a hierarchy of rights, and the kind of complexity that you see in the ethical decision making plays out on the legal side as well. Obviously the governments can and do and will and have infringed on fundamental liberties. They're entitled to do so when, for example, Quebec's Public Health Act is invoked. It essentially allows the government to infringe on virtually all kinds of rights. The international law framework is that you are not allowed to derogate from certain rights, regardless of a public emergency, even if it threatens the existential, even if it's an existential threat to the country. And those are the right to life, as you might expect, the right to be free from torture and cruel and unusual punishment or treatment, and the like. So leaving aside those sort of, clear exceptions, governments do have a fair amount of wiggle room, particularly in states of emergency, which are allowed to upend, if you will, the usual rules. The usual rules do not apply. And so it's important to understand that once those rules have been invoked, the normal legal framework is altered without any need to alter the Constitution or even to introduce new legislation. It's baked in to the existing legal framework.
Wow. And I know I mentioned in the introduction your work in Sri Lanka, where this state of emergency lasted for 25 years. So I do want to come back to that during our discussion to see where, the role of states of emergency and how long they can last and what happens when they are revoked. So we'll definitely get to that. But let's get to the crux of the question. I think that's really at the heart of today's conversation. And that is the balance between protecting the health of the population while preserving individual freedoms as best as we can. So, or to put it another way, I guess the question would be, what obligations do individuals have to protect themselves and others from COVID-19? And what role should governments play in ensuring that we live up to these obligations? Professor King, you want to jump in maybe for the first response to that?
Sure. So we live in a society that provides collective protections, including healthcare, and also values personal freedom. But this entails a kind of tacit agreement, if you will. On one hand, we are free to assume risks to our own health. We're free to ingest products that might be harmful to our health, to engage in activities, sports, other things that entail risks to our health. We're able to do so in a large part because the government provides a safety net to protect us from some of the worst consequences of those risks. And I think in this way, this echoes what Pearl was just saying about our rights being interdependent. It's not like we're individual actors who have the freedom to assume risks and have those risks affect only us. They impact other people as well. We, in some ways, have the luxury to take those risks because we depend on the government to provide things like a health and social safety net to mitigate the worst harms that go along with those risks. But the bargain has two other parts. First, we have a responsibility to ensure that our actions don't harm others. So we can take risks that might threaten our own health, but if that also entails harm to others, then I do think the government has a strong and legitimate rationale for preventing us from taking those risks in order to mitigate the harms to others. Second, the government has the power to reduce unnecessary risks to the population, particularly risks that arise when individual risk-taking may harm others. So in the case of COVID-19, governments have, and I think correctly in my view, decided that individuals' freedoms to assume risks is overridden by the harm that this may present to others and to public health in general, right? And that is what underlies things like mask mandates and vaccine mandates. Well, that said, I think it's important to recognize that this calculation, this weighing of the costs and benefits of putting restrictions on these freedoms may change over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic as the epidemiology of the pandemic shifts and as we learn more and more both about the epidemiology and the effectiveness of different kinds of public health measures.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Professor Eliadis, where would the legal sort of perspective come in on this?
Well, I guess I would maybe take issue with the way in which the question was initially framed. So I actually don't think individuals directly have legal obligations in the sense that you have mentioned to them. The sort of general deal, if you will, from a kind of social compact perspective, if I could use that language, harkening back to Nick's reference to the deal, is that in small l liberal democracies, you can basically do whatever you want unless the government says otherwise. That really is the sort of deal. You have the right to live your life as you see fit and to choose the social goods and the choices that you see fit, provided there is no, criminal or legal sanction. If you damage someone or hurt someone or harm someone because of your actions, we have things like torts and delicts and so on that provide for civil responsibility for people who have done that, and that's a legal restriction with regard to, for example, negligence. The old analogy is, knowingly throwing a baseball at somebody's window, you're going to break the window, and so you're going to have to pay for that. So in terms of disease, we have had a recent example with AIDS, for example, of people being accused of assault for having had sexual relationships with other people, knowing that they were infected. And there's been a strong pushback legally and in the courts against that, because the evidence shows that over time, with use of retrovirals, that viral load is so low for many people that indeed that risk isn't there, and therefore criminal prosecution is not appropriate. And the reason I raise that is to illustrate that point about shifting risk and changing knowledge about the science, because that directly informs the way that the law responds. So the limit is, you are entitled to limit rights in a reasonable manner, and this is written directly into the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Rights can be limited provided those limits are reasonable limits justified in a free and democratic society. And so that is, again, baked into our Constitution, it's baked into the Charter, and it creates this balancing capacity that we've been talking about. And that is really different from the sort of absolute freedom concept that comes up to us, sadly, from some groups in our neighbors to the south, and indeed has been picked up in the Canadian context. That does not represent the law as most countries understand it to be. It certainly does not reflect international law, and I think it's extremely disruptive in terms of people's understanding of and perception of the way that the law works.
Okay, and I actually have a couple of questions specifically around court challenges, which I want to get to, but let me just sort of counter that, Professor Eliadis. I'm just curious. So how does this sort of liberal democracy framework justify laws like seatbelt laws or ingesting illegal drugs if really they're only harming ourselves and not anyone else?
Well, the second part of your sentence, of course, is the important one. And not harming anyone else. If you are not wearing a seatbelt, you may not only kill yourself, you may actually have an accident that damages other people. So that's the first point. The second point is we have, and this back to Nick's point about the underlying sort of social security / public health nets that underpin reckless actions, we put into place rules to protect people's safety and put into place those restrictions in order to make sure the state is doing its job in providing reasonable limits on people's behavior that would otherwise be reckless, cause undue harms to themselves and to others. Narcotics and controlled substances, obviously rapidly changing area in terms of how we deal with this. We know that there's a lot of data, for example, that even with so-called hard drugs, that safe injection sites and government intervention has been present in order to allow people to ingest these when they're addicts and to prevent harm. And so it's always this balancing game between how much harm, who else is harmed, and what are the social norms that are at play. But again, the overriding rule is people do have a certain degree of liberty unless other interests, other people's rights start to come into play. And it's that meeting place where people's rights stop and others begin.
Mm-hmm. Professor King.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. I also want to maybe push back a little bit and use the seatbelt example, because there's two ways of framing seatbelt regulations. One is that they are infringing on people's freedoms to drive without wearing a seatbelt. But there's another way of framing it, which is it is requiring certain products to be as safe as possible, in the same way that we broadly accept regulations to ensure that the food that we eat is as safe as possible, that the drugs that we are prescribed are as safe as possible. So I think there, and I think we're going to talk about this a little later in the discussion as well. I think that framing these things as infringements on liberties and rights and freedoms can both be an actual genuine expression of, pushback on trying to infringe on rights and freedoms, but often there are sort of interested parties that want to frame these things as an infringement on freedom rather than government judiciously trying to regulate risks and threats to our health and the health of others.
And if I may, if I may just jump in on that very quickly, I would say the two are actually not incompatible. It seems to me that consumer protection and making sure that there are proper standards and that manufacturers, for example, are putting into place proper standards as an entirely normal part of the government regulatory framework. It is consistent with rights in the sense that it does protect people and is designed to make sure that people are protected. So those two actually go hand in hand.
Okay, great. Well, thank you both. So let me talk a little bit about the situation in Quebec right now. I know not all of our viewers live in Quebec, but this province has certainly seen some of the most drastic public health measures during the pandemic, at least by North American standards. We've had curfews twice in place. We've had regular limits and bans on private gatherings, closing of religious establishments, and a bunch of other measures. So I'm just curious to get a sense of what each of you make of the approach of the Quebec government. Has the government been justified in implementing measures that, some would argue, touch on the very fundamental freedoms we take for granted? Or have they gone a bit too far? Professor King, you want to start with that?
Sure. So I think there's been good and bad. On the good side, I think that early in the pandemic, when it seems like so long ago, but it's worth refreshing our memories that early in the pandemic, early 2020, there was considerable uncertainty about the basic epidemiology of the disease, and especially about the likely effectiveness of different public health measures. We had some lessons from other coronaviruses, from SARS and from MERS, but it just wasn't clear what would work. And I think Quebec responded relatively quickly and prudently to try to flatten the curve and to reduce transmission. And in that context, implementing fairly severe restrictions on basic rights to travel, to get together in groups and so forth was justified, right? Given this uncertainty, the balance of costs and benefits in reducing these rights and harms was certainly justified. And I think they've continued to take the pandemic seriously and place public health at the forefront. On the bad side, I think there has been a distinct lack of transparency regarding decision-making and in particular data, particularly about social inequalities in health, in morbidity and mortality related to COVID-19. And I think that the early prudential response generated a lot of goodwill and community spirit. I mean, witness here in Mall the proliferation of Ça va bien aller posters, right? There was a lot of sense of we're in this together and the government is doing right by us by being prudential. I think the lack of transparency has really squandered a lot of that trust. And I should also say that the Quebec leadership has kind of utterly failed to acknowledge the determinative role of existing problems in the healthcare system and elsewhere. So just, you gave the example of curfews. I think early in the pandemic, implementing curfews, there really wasn't any evidence that they would work, but I think the population could say, well, we'll deal with this because it might work. As the pandemic has progressed, my reading of the evidence is that they really don't do much. And I think now, and especially, the keeping the curfews in place for longer than seemed necessary and without an appropriate evidence base and not being very transparent about it, I think that's been a severe misstep. And I think it's hampering efforts to continue to be prudential moving forward.
Okay. Professor Eliadis, I know you don't have the medical background, but you've got the legal framework. So would you agree with that assessment overall?
The data, as I understand it, for example, in Europe, there have been some studies done on curfews in Greece, which is my European citizenship, and in Luxembourg and some other places, show that the use of a curfew may delay spread and may have an effect on flattening the curve, but I'm not aware, and maybe Nick knows, I don't think there's any definitive studies on the usefulness of curfews. I think there's two big issues here, though, that speak to the question of lack of data, and particularly disaggregated data as it affects subpopulations of, for example, racialized minorities, people who experience poverty, people who are sort of frontline workers who may be overrepresented in certain communities, people with disabilities who have been completely ignored in this whole thing, and only far too little, far too late, the impacts on people who are in long-term care facilities who are not counted in Canadian statistical data. So, this is I think a huge problem overall, and it seems to me that this is something that's been much better researched in the United States than it has in Canada. And again, understanding the legal response depends on the data. My undergraduate was in health sciences, and I've always thought to myself, that the data that decides whether or not something is reasonable or not is not a philosophical question that's resolved in the abstract. It's a practical question that's resolved by the information. That does change. And I don't think it was inappropriate for the government at the beginning to take a precautionary approach and to, put into place these measures. The problem with these measures is that is twofold, and I'll close on that. One of them is that they fail to take into account subpopulations that are incapable of or complying with or adversely impacted by the measures. Homeless people clearly were one of those groups in the curfew. It's hard to even think about how much more ridiculous you could be than to put into place a curfew and apply it to homeless people, to have it drawn to your attention, and then to say, well, never mind, the police will be reasonable as people start freezing to death outside. It was completely irresponsible in my view. So the lack of caring about how these measures affect people who don't have a voice in the political system, it seems to me, is fundamental. And then the second point, which I'll pause on, is this democratic deficit, the lack of transparency. We're not in front of a legislature. Everything is suspended. Who makes the decisions and how are they made?
Mm-hmm. Well said. So maybe I'll go back to you, Professor King, just on that point, because you also referenced in your remarks twice now, I think, discrimination against specific groups in the community or disadvantaged groups. So maybe I'll invite you to jump in on that, because I think it's been a bit of an underreported part of the story. So what groups are we thinking of, and how have they been perhaps more disadvantaged by some of the public health measures than others?
Sure. So I think this is, as Pearl stated, this has been a constant problem since the beginning of the pandemic, and it's a problem that could be solved, right? I mean, early on in the pandemic, it was noticed very early on, especially by people living in neighborhoods with high proportion of racialized or visible minorities, that they seemed to be bearing a disproportionate burden of COVID-19, and they were begging the government to sort of collect statistics to help them out. And it actually spurred some grassroots campaigns to try to collect these statistics. And of course, in academia, many colleagues of mine in epidemiology have kind of jumped into the breach and so forth. So one answer is we don't know enough, right? As Pearl said, there's a democratic deficit. If you're claiming to make evidence-based decisions, but you're resisting gathering evidence, I don't think you can have it both ways. And I think that has been a real breach of trust and a real problem. Mm-hmm. To get to your specific question, it's widely acknowledged in public health and epidemiology, first of all, that most diseases disproportionately impact people who are poor, people who are victims of social or economic marginalization. I mean, there are very few, if any, diseases that this does not happen. So, I mean, I gave interviews early in the pandemic which said, this is not a surprise that this is happening. This should have been foreseeable and should have been actionable. So on one hand, is the disease harming different communities disproportionately? And does that mean that the government should implement targeted kinds of efforts to try to help those communities? The second is, are the mitigation measures disproportionately harming some communities? And I think Pearl already gave us one. curfews disproportionately harm homeless people. So we have to deal with that. Do we revisit curfews? Do we say that because of this disproportionate harm, they're not justified? Or do we tweak the curfews in some ways so that homeless people will not be held accountable in the same manner? I'll give you a second example, which is potential harms to mental health of many people, but especially young people and especially children at schools. I think that, Quebec early on was making an effort to keep schools open and so forth. And I think that was in part potentially driven by an effort to protect mental health of young people. But I think that the mental health impacts of continued restrictions has really flown under the radar. And again, I think there are academic studies showing that this has negative impact on mental health. Again, this doesn't give us the answer to say, well, because it harms some people's mental health, we get rid of all restrictions. But we need to gather the evidence, it's out there, and we need to make the tough decision of weighing these costs and benefits and being very transparent about saying, look, there's a trade-off. We have decided to come down on this side of the trade-off. And unfortunately, we just haven't seen that.
Right. Okay, great. So just a reminder, anyone who's watching live, if you have any questions for either of our panelists, you can send them to us by email at aoc@mcgill.ca. Professor Eliadis, let me ask you, I know you're both affiliated with the Max Bell School of Public Policy. I'm curious to get your sense of what role do you think public opinion is playing in how far governments are willing to go in pushing through public health measures? So in other words, are our leaders focused exclusively on the science? And I understand the science changes over time. Or do you think they have one eye on public opinion polls when deciding on what measures and policies to put in place? And is that why we've seen such divergent reactions in different provinces and countries throughout the pandemic?
Well, politicians are politicians, and so obviously they don't spend all their time worrying about science, although the better ones probably do. This government in particular, I think in Quebec, is very focused on popular response. You heard it, you hear it from Legault himself. I mean, he said yesterday, people are fed up. I'm hearing that people are fed up. His polling numbers are going down. So absolutely, I think they are looking at the science, but the science changes, and I don't think there's a problem with adjusting public health responses. I don't think that's a sign of irresponsibility on the part of scientists. People say, "Oh, the rules change. That's terrible." Well, no, the rules change because we learn different stuff and we respond in a sort of sensible way. But I would like to say that the debate about whether or not we should protect markets and economies and jobs, as opposed to shutdowns, is something that has occupied the polls, the pollsters, and popular opinions, particularly in Western Europe, certainly in Canada, definitely in the United States. And the data on this, I think, is really interesting. A study was done towards the end of 2021 on whether, on the relationship between measures that suppress disease and measures that keep the economy wide open and therefore set aside or minimize the role of disease suppression. And the data was really interesting. And I think it is affecting and should affect political responses. The data shows that countries that have used measures to suppress disease have done better at both disease suppression and protecting the economy than countries that focused on protecting the economy. And I think that's a really important finding because it also it aligns with the human rights instinctive response, which I think happily now is validated, which is you protect life first. Mm-hmm. And you are better off protecting life by protecting life than you are by protecting wallets. Right. as your first reaction. So I think the political response, we've seen what's happened with Boris Johnson in the UK. I mean, as we'd say in Quebec, plus stupide que ça tu meurs. But if somebody actually engages in behavior like that, I think they can expect to see their political chances affected. Governments that endanger the population by responding to populism, I think will be tested by resurgence of disease. I think in Quebec right now, given the March 14th announcement, that everything is going to be lifted, a lot's going to depend on what happens when those restrictions are lifted, and they're going to need to look at whether or not the impacts are being felt in ICUs, and that's going to be just an empirical question.
Okay, great. So I do want to address, and maybe I'll start with you, Professor King, for this next one. I don't want to talk about convoys, freedom convoys. We hadn't even envisioned freedom convoys being so high on our radar when we initially sat down, the three of us, to talk about putting this panel together today. But maybe I'll just preface it. I have some other stats that I just came across yesterday. I guess a poll came out in Canada, and essentially it showed that 2/3 of Canadians said they were against the message of the convoy, 1/3 were in favor. If you broke it down, roughly 2/3 of Canadians felt or agreed with the statement that the convoy represents a small minority of Canadians who are selfishly thinking only about themselves. And yet, about half of Canadians agreed with the following statement: I am vaccinated against COVID-19, but I sympathize with the concerns and frustrations being voiced by people involved in the trucker protests in Ottawa. So it's interesting to see the numbers feel a bit divergent. So I guess my broad question to you, Professor King, is, what do you make of this particular protest movement around the convoy, the Freedom Convoy, and will it ultimately make any difference in how federal and provincial governments move forward in their approach to public health?
Well, to respond to the last question first, I hope not. I actually don't think that those numbers that you cited are strange. I think that actually makes sense that people would respond in both of those ways. Let's be clear about the convoy and the associated protests, because apparently it's sort of metastasizing and other protests are forming. It's not about freedom with a capital F. It's about a small group of people refusing to do something that they don't want to do. And it is certainly their right to state that they don't want to do something. But it sets up a false dichotomy where they're on the side of freedom and anyone who disagrees with them is not, right? They've called it the Freedom Convoy, not the protest against, the reasoned protest against particular public health measures. I think that is a political action. But in a sense, nothing could be further from the truth. So in a small sense, and I think this is what that poll picked up upon, they have chosen to restrict the freedoms of thousands of private citizens and businesses in Ottawa and elsewhere in the name of getting their way. I don't think you can be a freedom convoy and have your tactic being restricting the freedoms of thousands of your fellow citizens. They're putting their choices above others' freedoms, their choices to refuse vaccination and to forcibly protest vaccine mandates, which has limited the choices and freedoms of others. But in a larger sense, I think they're willfully ignoring a fact that I think it's important for us to acknowledge, which is vaccines also play a role in preserving rights and freedoms, allowing us, helping us congregate and work and go about our business with much less fear that doing so will expose us and our loved ones to deadly disease, right? Certainly a mandate for vaccination does infringe on people's individual choices in the sense of forcing them to put something in their bodies. But it is also in many ways in the service of encouraging and increasing freedom, right? In the sense of making it much less risky for everyone to do things like go to school, shop in businesses, congregate, go to social occasions, and so forth. So again, I think this is not a case of freedom being represented by the convoy and protesters against authoritarian public health measures. This is a case of balancing choices and freedoms, and I think it would be a real mistake for governments to accept this false dichotomy, to listen to the idea that if we go against what they're saying, we are going against freedom. I think there's a real positive case to be made which aligns freedom with public health measures.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. So actually, I do want to move into the question of vaccines specifically. And in fact, we're starting to get some questions coming in from alumni. And the first question just came to us from Abe Wagan, who is asking, why are governments not allowed to mandate vaccinations or at least protect non-vaccinated people from themselves? Which I think gets to this bigger question, which I want to address as well, which is sort of how far can governments go to persuade the unvaccinated to get immunized? And the sense I'm getting, at least here in Quebec, and I want to say this respectfully, but it almost feels like they're either running out of ideas or they're turning this into being a more punitive discussion. So at first it felt like the non-vaccinated would be not permitted to go into enclosed spaces, whether it's airplanes or trains or gyms and restaurants. Now it feels like it's liquor stores, big box retailers. It feels a bit more punitive. So I guess maybe I'll start with you, Professor Eliadis. What is your take on the measures let's say, to get the unvaccinated immunized at this point?
The basic principle in Canadian law, and certainly this is the case in Quebec, is that a vaccination is a medical service and you are entitled to refuse health services. So that's what they're talking about. I think it's important to recognize that, the position that the anti-vaxxers, if I could use that short form, are taking is not completely ungrounded in law, and it's not ridiculous when you look at it on its face. You do have a right to refuse medical treatment. Unlike, for example, there are places in the United States where vaccinations are mandatory. Again, really interesting in a country that says that it values freedom, and many of whom think that freedom is valued more there than here, where they actually don't have the right to refuse a medical service. But let me just come back to the Quebec context for a moment. The ability to refuse a vaccine means that you pose a direct threat not only to the health but to the life, liberty, and security of the person, i.e. the civil liberties, i.e. the freedom of other people. So this is not an issue of, or mainly between, liberty on the one hand and the right to health on the other. Those two are interconnected in each person. And in order for health measures and our society to work, in order for freedoms to have any meaning, as opposed to what I feel like doing, on a Wednesday at whatever time it is, the key point, I think, needs to be that we need to have empathy for and reciprocity for recognizing not only my freedom, but yours. Those two have to coexist in order for the system to work. It isn't just that it's health versus liberty. No, it's that my liberty and your liberty need to coexist at the same time. And how do we do that? Right. And so it's managing that space, I think, where we look at things like proportionality over breadth, impact that is rationally connected to the public policy objective. And in this case, unless of course the person has an underlying medical condition or something, getting vaccinated is an impairment of your physical integrity, yes, but compared to the physical integrity rights of those around you and the capacity of others to function, and the responsibility to uphold the public health system and the rights to health of others, all of those things put together, I think, militate in favor of measures to strongly encourage people to get vaccinated. And certainly, I don't think it's that people have run out of ideas. I think we want to make life more difficult for people who choose not to get vaccinated. I'm okay with that. I'm not sure I'm okay with mandating vaccinations in the current context. I realize reasonable people may differ on that, but I believe that it's perfectly acceptable to take public health measures to limit the sphere of risk that unvaccinated people pose for others.
Okay, great. So Professor King, let me follow up. Let me ask you this three-part question on the same topic.
Can I just jump in on that
Sure.
just really quickly to
go ahead.
To sort of jump in on what Pearl said. One of my favorite studies was done in California, and in California there were mandates that school children be vaccinated so that they could attend school, and there was always the option for parents to opt out. And at some point, California made it more difficult to opt out. And what the studies have shown is that the number of parents who, after it was made more difficult, went ahead and vaccinated their children sort of jumped. And I think there's a lesson in here for us, which is vaccine hesitancy or anti-vaccinationism. There are many, many different reasons people might choose not to get vaccinated. It might be lack of education. It might be a reasonable worry about potential risks, and better education and better communication could deal with that. In many cases, there's a symbolic dimension to it, right? Where people sort of say, I'm not letting the government make me do this. And they're willing to go to a certain extent, but if you make it more difficult, that symbolic dimension drops away and they're willing to do it anyway. So I think I'm just sort of, saying what Pearl is saying. I really want to emphasize that, yes, there are legitimate, real trade-offs here. We are violating people's, forcibly violating people's bodily integrity with a mandate. But again, I think that it's too easy, as with the convoy, to think there's this gigantic broad groundswell of people who are absolutely dedicated to preserving personal freedom and drawing the line of vaccines, when instead I think what you have is a lot of more free-floating dissatisfactions, fatigue with the pandemic, worries about government, and they crystallize around vaccines. And I think there are a lot of people who are really generating this idea that this is the thing. This is where you have to draw the line in the sand. And I think there is a sort of hardcore minority of people who really believe that, but I think a lot of it has been actually blown out of proportion to a certain extent.
Right. So let me get back to my three-part question. It's really the third part, I think, that's going to be the most intriguing for you to answer. So the question is, are vaccine mandates fair? Part two, do they work? But then the big question is, ultimately, if they do work at getting more people vaccinated, does it matter if they're fair?
Yeah, those are three gigantic questions. I don't think I can address all three at the same time. So, okay, are they fair? There are many reasons to institute all sorts of public health measures, including things like vaccine mandates. Some justified and legitimate, others not. If there's good evidence that they're effective in reducing the harms of COVID-19 and don't unfairly discriminate against particular social groups, and I'm speaking from an ethical perspective rather than a legal perspective, then we can say that they are acceptable, right? That whatever, if there's no disproportionate harm, then they're fair. However, if they're ineffective or unfairly discriminatory, then they're unacceptable, right? So then the question is, are they effective? I can't claim to have read all the evidence on the effectiveness of vaccine mandates. And the thing about it is there are many different kinds of vaccine mandates, right? You can target a particular population like school children. You can try to make it broad-based. There are different kinds of, like the proposal that was floated earlier about sort of having a tax on the unvaccinated versus an actual, when smallpox was eradicated in the 1970s and 1980s, in many jurisdictions, there was real mandated vaccination, right? And with smallpox, a very different kind of disease, yes, vaccination worked in eradicating this disease. So I think the jury is still out on whether a particular kind of mandate will or will not be effective. But to get to your final question here, if they work and they were unfair, does it matter? I think it does. I think it is very important that governments not be completely utilitarian about this. I think we do have to take fairness into account, right? And I think that governments have to demonstrate, again, I'm sort of sounding like a broken record, that they have taken the costs and benefits seriously, right? The most we can ask for a government to do is to transparently weigh the costs and benefits, including disproportionate costs for different groups of people, be very transparent with us, and say why they have taken certain measures.
Mm-hmm. So, Professor Eliadis, to follow up on that, I'll maybe direct this next question to the lawyer on the panel. Are you concerned at all that by having these kinds of measures against the unvaccinated, we could essentially be creating two classes of citizens, as many of the unvaccinated have argued is already happening?
So there was a really interesting reaction from one of the protesters in Ottawa who said, that he was protesting because his family wouldn't see him. He wasn't vaccinated and his family had said, we don't want to be exposed to this risk. And he felt that so, this reminds me of the kind of thing that John Stuart Mill used to talk about, which was you don't only worry about the tyranny of the law, you worry about the tyranny of public opinion. You probably, in fact, these days, in the days of Twitter and so on, you probably worry more about the latter than the former. The law doesn't work anywhere near as fast as news cycles and social media does. So people are doing that to themselves, and I don't know that you necessarily need the law to intervene. There's peer pressure being placed on people, and that's part of the way society works. People are actually right now not being required to vaccinate. So if you don't want to be vaccinated, then your sphere of activity is limited. But that's also true, if I want to travel to certain countries in Asia and Africa, I can't if I don't have a yellow fever vaccine. For example. So are already classes of citizens that are built into your access to and use of certain medical treatments that end up affecting A, your health, and B, your capacity to, and we've accepted them completely on these other areas. It's not entirely clear to me why this is being treated as differently, but three possible reasons that I just want to put out there and see how folks react. Reason number one, I think, has to do with something that has nothing to do with the vaccine, but with the confluence, if you will, of what happened last year on January 6th in the United States, this radical reinterpretation of freedom as meaning the capacity to engage in seditious behavior, the capacity to use and deploy white supremacist movements, neo-Nazi movements, and so on, to put a freedom sticker on that, and then to export that into Canada. And I don't think we should underestimate what is happening here. I don't think we should underestimate the fact that funding is being used from the United States coming into Canada in order to influence Canadian policy and Canadian politics. And I think it's a real danger. And I want to say that, memories are short. But in 2012, around 2012 to 2015 in particular, the previous government, the Harper government, previous government, used Canadian tax services in order to audit and effectively attack progressive organizations in this country on the grounds that they were funnels for illegal money. And I'm talking about perfectly legitimate organizations: Amnesty International, Oxfam Canada, the David Suzuki Foundation, Dying with Dignity, and so on and so forth. And the force of the government was deployed against these organizations because of that. And now we have a situation where money is clearly being funneled into Canada in order to support right-wing groups, anti-immigrant groups, manifestly racist groups. And so far, as I can tell, other than the GoFundMe page being taken down, not much has been done. And certainly I think we need to have an inquiry into this, and that has nothing to do with this disease. And I think it's important to keep the two separate.
Okay, well said. So let me move on to this next question. I know, Professor King, we discussed this a little bit before we went live, so I know you have a bit to say on this. But what do you make of this notion that it's the healthcare system itself that's broken, and that it's the very same governments who have let this happen under their watch, who are now shifting the burden onto the population through excessive public health restrictions?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So there's a saying, I don't know who it's originally attributed to, that epidemics are biological expressions of social and structural inequalities, right? And I think we can look at the COVID-19 in a way as a stress test for Canadian political, healthcare, and social safety net systems. And in many respects here in Quebec, and in particular with respect to the healthcare system, they've failed, right? If we cast our memories back to the early pandemic, what were we trying to do? Flatten the curve, right? And what does flatten the curve mean? Flatten the curve means don't overload the healthcare system, right? And the big problem is that the healthcare system nevertheless has been overloaded. And I think moving forward, and again, this really plays into public trust in government response to the pandemic, right? How do we deal with this? And there are many different ways that we can deal with this. The way that I would prefer is that the government can acknowledge that pre-existing problems in the healthcare system, which are not news to anyone, right, in terms of undercapacity, in terms of overworked healthcare workers, a myriad problems, right, that they exist, that because of them, it made the COVID-19 pandemic worse, and it required more public health measures and longer public health measures. We can acknowledge this and say, now is our opportunity to respond to and rectify these problems in the healthcare system. Another way, which I think many people are upset about, with I think some justification, is this idea that we are demonizing the unvaccinated. And again, I do think that vaccination is the right thing, but I think that there is a legitimate concern that rather than addressing the fundamental structural problems in the healthcare system moving forward, we try to distract attention by saying, well, it's the unvaccinated that are really the problem. It's possible for both to be the case. And I think if we only shift attention onto the unvaccinated, then that's a real problem moving forward. This Weir Way is an opportunity to make the healthcare and the social safety net better. And I think we would really squander the opportunity by trying to brush that all under the rug.
Right. Okay, wonderful. So we only have a few minutes left. I do want to address a couple more issues. One which I mentioned earlier, and maybe I'll turn to you, Professor Eliadis, was around the issue of court challenges. So I read, for example, last week that there are 2 church congregations in Ontario that are taking the government to court, arguing that forcing them to shut down or operate at limited capacity infringes on their constitutional rights to freedom of religion. And of course, here in Quebec, many who are ticketed for violating the curfew are challenging the fines in court, also on constitutional grounds. So I guess my question is, do these cases have any merit, or from a legal perspective, any chance of success? Or do you expect the courts would ultimately support government regulations on the basis that they've been operating under the state of emergency?
Yes, no, maybe, in order.
Okay.
So,
all right. Please elaborate.
On the first one, I mean, clearly they have merit in the sense that by restricting the freedom of religious organizations to congregate, you are directly infringing religious freedom. So the answer to that clearly is yes. I think the more interesting question is, are those reasonable limits, and how is that decided? Well, one of the ways you would look is to see how, for example, and I think this is the basis for some of the constitutional challenges, is whether or not the measures in place treated religious groups, for example, differently than, say, big box stores, or treated religious groups differently than karaoke bars, or treated religious groups differently than, shopping malls and so on. And so if the religious groups are capable or able to show that they have been treated in equal, with lack of equality, if you will, and treated in a way that disproportionately impacted a fundamental freedom. You don't really have the same fundamental freedom to shop than you do to go to church. There's actually a legal protection for religion that is not there for retail. So I think there might be an argument that could be made there. With regard to constitutional challenges against vaccine measures, most of them so far have failed. And the reason for that is because most of the challenges so far, with the exception of the curfew one we referred to earlier, have been extremely broad-based, and courts have not really been able to determine what the actual specific legal issues are, except for my freedom's been infringed, all these measures is terrible, which is not really a legal argument. And so the reason the curfew challenge worked was because it was a specific directive, a specific order in council that was targeted, or ministerial directive. 1. 2, there was a specific subpopulation that was targeted for whom it was impossible to meet the criteria. And so the court said, there's an expression in law, nobody nul est tenu de faire l'impossible. Nobody is required to do something that's impossible. It's a sort of legal assumption. So the court said, it didn't even need to invoke constitutional principles. It just said, we're suspending this because it's impossible for the homeless population to even meet the criteria. So the other cases where the courts have agreed that the measures are inappropriate have been on technical issues. So somebody in Spain tried to have all of the measures struck down, and they partially succeeded because the Spanish government had used the wrong vehicle. It's a technical argument. I don't think it affects our discussion today. So I think the question from a legal perspective is the question sufficiently targeted and clear with regard to the impacts on a specific group or a specific minority, such that A, their rights are infringed, and B, that it's not a reasonable limit. And the courts are going to look at data about what was done to other sectors, what the comparative issues are, and whether or not specific groups have been disadvantaged or disproportionately impacted by the measure.
Right. Okay. Well, I guess we'll have to see how those continue to play out in the courts. So we have a few minutes left, a couple minutes. Maybe I have time for one more question, which I'll put to each of you. I kind of want to look ahead into the long-term implications and where do we go from here? And I don't want to go all conspiracy theorist on any of you here, but I'm wondering, in your opinions, do you think that what we've experienced the last 2 years and this sort of, debate between, health protection, civil liberties, infringing on freedoms, should we as a society, as citizens of a democratic society, be concerned that we've set a precedent for future governments and future leaders to sort of clamp down on freedoms the next time we have a civil disturbance or a natural disaster or, God forbid, the next pandemic? Or do you think that we're really learning lessons from here that will prepare us better for the future the next time we have to go through this again? So maybe we'll end on that. I'll start with you, Professor King, if you can give me a 90-second answer to that.
Sure, I'll try to keep myself to 90 seconds. So number one, I think it's worth saying there is a legitimate worry that measures instituted in the context of a pandemic can be seized upon by genuinely authoritarian governments and become ossified into permanent measures. I think we've seen that in Brazil, in China to a certain extent, where authoritarian regimes will implement, say, surveillance measures and then just keep them on in perpetuity, kind of like things that were instituted in the wake of the Patriot Act. That said, I don't think that's going on here. And I take a little bit more of a sanguine, long-term historical view. Right? The history of public health is littered with people employing the language of freedom to protest public health measures. In fact, almost every major legitimate public health intervention, including many programs that we think of as unobjectionable and standard, were initially fought on the grounds that they were thought to impinge on individual rights. Seatbelt laws, which we talked about, motorcycle and bicycle helmets, speed limits, bans on smoking in public places, taxes or bans on harmful products. Repeatedly, we see these issues come up. So, I think this is just one more chapter in a longer historical story. And in particular, pandemics have a way of exposing social divisions and in sort of exacerbating those divisions in the short term, particularly, and Pearl already mentioned this, but I think it's worth repeating. Divisions around racism, around xenophobia, around, reactions to and oppression of minority groups often are brought up in the context of epidemics. There are always entities that will capitalize on these social divisions for personal and political gain. I think that's what's happening with the convoy. I think that's what's happening with what we see with a lot of protests, in the fact that they're associated with, frankly, ethno-national and racist agendas. I don't think the lesson that we should learn is that something fundamental has changed here. As I said, I think this is a chapter in a longer story where these epidemics happen, governments respond to them, people protest against them, other entities try to capitalize on some legitimate worries and fears, and hopefully it will die down as the epidemic eventually either dies out or becomes endemic in some ways. So my hope is that this is not going to fundamentally change things and that our democratic structures are robust enough to withstand them.
Wonderful. I think that was maybe 290 seconds, but very well said.
Sorry, I'm an academic,
Yeah, that's
Never
okay.
give 90 seconds when 290 are there.
All right. So, Professor Eliadis, should I give you 15 seconds or well, take the bit of time you need? But so where do we go from here? What is the long-term prognosis here for this?
Well, Derek, I'd like to maybe start to end this where you started, which was around the Sri Lanka measures. What we learned from the Sri Lanka measures was that sort of coronavirus coups, which I think is a nice bumper sticker for what Nick was talking about, haven't happened in Canada, really. There have been some issues around democratic deficits and so on, but we haven't seen that kind of reaction that we saw in Hungary and Brazil and Philippines and other countries. So I'm not concerned about that. And I completely agree with Nick that we need to take a long view on this. One of my favorite books growing up was called Rat's Lice in History. It's a book by Hans Zinser, and it's a fantastic, I think, overview or survey for those of you interested in this of how plagues and epidemics and pandemics come and go and how we respond to them as societies. And I think in the long term, what we need to pay attention to is not that pandemics come and go, because they're going to, and not that governments need to engage in lawful I emphasize lawful, measures in order to control them. The issue is that legally, the measures need to be temporary. They need to be sunsetted so that you need to have regular government involvement to make sure that they're resuscitated on a proper basis. Quebec and Canada have done this throughout the pandemic. And, you know, at the end of the day, I think the real question is maintaining democratic structures. And I want to close with something, you know, that you asked about earlier, is a significant reinvestment in Canada's health infrastructure, because it is broken. It clearly isn't working right now. And that is the responsibility of a series, not just this government, a series of governments in this province. The federal government needs to start attaching conditionalities to health funding. It's not a popular thing to say in this province. But I do think that it's the single biggest lesson here is to look at what's happening to minorities, look at what's happening to older people, look at what's happening to the health structure, and to make sure we use this experience as an opportunity to not only build back better, but to build a decent and humane infrastructure in this country.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Those are wonderful remarks on both of your parts to end this. And for sure, we're going to come back, I think, later this spring. One of the ideas I'm thinking about for a future webcast is this whole notion of how do we build back our healthcare networks here in Quebec, here in Canada, around the world, more, you know, to prevent, you know, future pandemics, or at least, you know, the pain of the pandemics, perhaps a bit less difficult than what we've been through the last 2 years. So that about wraps up the time we do have today. Before we close, I would like to remind everyone that this video will be available at this very same link soon after our recording ends. So feel free to share with others who may not have been able to tune in live today. I would, of course, like to extend my deep gratitude to our two wonderful panelists, Professors Pearl Eliadis and Nicholas B. King, for joining me today and offering such great insight into a complicated topic. I think we can all agree that this was yet another great showcase of McGill expertise being applied to such an important societal debate. Please stay tuned to your McGill email and social media feeds for more updates on alumni webcasts and more great alumni programming. Among these initiatives is McGill 24, our annual Day of Giving, when the global McGill community comes together to celebrate the university and raise much needed funds for students and researchers. This year's McGill 24 Day of Giving is taking place in exactly 1 month on Wednesday, March 9th. So please stay tuned for updates, and please consider making a gift to McGill. Until then, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.